All right, so today we're going to start our very last chapter. This is going to cover owning small businesses. Today we're just going to talk about how to start a small business, or rather, what kinds of things you need to think about before you start a small business. So here's the plan. So we're starting that final chapter, as I mentioned. We're going to cover the following topics today. We're going to talk about compound interest, which you would have learned in a previous math course. Then we'll talk about some things to consider before starting a small business, and then we're also going to talk about startup costs and operating expenses. It shouldn't be a very long lesson today, and this whole chapter is also not very long. There's only about 3 segments to it, so we're almost done. In other words, we're almost totally finished this whole Math 30-3 course. Anyway, let's get going. Before we start, though, this unit will be a mixture of several mathematical skills you've developed in the past, right? So in other words, it's kind of a weird unit to teach because a lot of it is just kind of putting together some information that you're just gathering from a certain situation. It's a little hard to explain, but later on, not necessarily today, but later on when we look at different lessons, you'll kind of see what I mean. You'll need to deal with percentages, fractions, compound interest, and much more. The number one thing to remember with percentages, although I'm sure you're fine with it, is if you wanted to find, like, let's say 15% of 200, in order to deal with that, you have to turn the percentage into a decimal. So it's got to be 0.15 of 200, so times 200. And then I'll help you calculate what 15% of 200 would be, for instance. You'll also need to know fractions. So again, similar to percentages, of course, it's kind of just a different expression, the same idea. Compound interest, which we're going to go over in a second, and much more. A lot of this unit deals with using mathematical understandings to make wise decisions for varying situations. In other words, there's going to be a lot of situations where you'll just be given some random situation. So you'll be saying, all right, suppose you're going to open a business here, and here's the information behind your business, and here's the information behind the location you're starting it up in. What would be a wise decision to make? So again, you just have to use some mathematical reasonings, which can come out of percentages, etc., to make wise choices for given situations. Anyway, let's start talking about compound interest. Just in case you've forgotten what compound interest is, loans are usually given under a system of compound interest. This is where the interest, so in other words, the percentage of the loan that they add on to what you pay as the price for borrowing it, is added back onto the owing amount over a number of compounding periods. So basically how it works is you borrow a certain lump sum of money, and then every month or so, whatever your compounding period is, maybe it's every 2 months, maybe it's every year, usually it is every month though, they'll add a percentage of what you borrowed onto what you have to pay. So basically it's more or less penalizing you for taking more time to pay back a loan. So the quicker you do it, generally speaking, the better. There's more to it than that because oftentimes they lock you into it, but that's the general idea. The formula for compound interest is this absolute, beefy looking thing right here. It is on your formula sheet. As a matter of fact, your formula sheet's even more generous than that. It actually even tells you what every letter means in it. So just to explain, A right here is the amount of money that you have to repay. P is what we call the principal. That's just how much you borrowed. So if you borrowed like $1,000, then P would be 1,000. R is the annual interest rate as a decimal. So if you paid a 4% interest rate, then the decimal would be 0.04. So make sure you're putting R as a decimal. It even says that on your formula sheet. So just make sure you understand that. N is the number of compounding periods per year. So in other words, if it was saying, oh, you're compounding monthly, well, there's 12 months in a year, so N would be 12. If it was like compounded every 2 months, well, then N would be 6, because there are 6 different groups of 2 months as the year goes on, okay? Or compounded seasonally, so every season, that'd be divided by 4, right? Because N would be 4. Now, T, however, T is the term of the loan in years. Let's keep that consistent here. So in other words, if you are planning on paying your loan back after 5 years, then T would be 5, for example. Again, this is all in the back of your formula sheet. None of this is anything you have to memorize by any means. You just need to know where it is and how to plug it in. We'll do a quick example here. Let's suppose you took out a loan for $5,000, borrowed at an interest rate of 2.50% per annum. That basically means per year, compounded monthly for 3 years. How much will you repay in total? Okay, so what I like doing is I like writing out the formula, okay, without anything else put in. So A equals P times 1 plus R over N to the power of N times T. A is how much you're repaying in total, so that's what we're looking for. P is your principal, that's how much money you borrowed, well, that's going to be 5,000, times by 1 plus R is your interest rate as a decimal. Well, 2.50%, you might say, oh, that's a decimal. Well, no, we need to get rid of the percentage altogether. You got to write that as a real decimal. That's going to be 0.0250. See how it's like, this is your 10th place, this is your 100th place. 1% is 1/100th of, of 100, right? So in other words, 2.5%, that 2.5 is right here, okay? Divided by N. N is the number of compounding periods in a year. Notice how it says compounded monthly. That tells you that you're going to be dividing this by 12 because there's 12 months in a year. And then that's going to be taken to the power of N times T. So to the power of 12 times the number of years that you're taking this out for. Well, it says 3 years, so 12 times 3. So notice how I did that. I kind of just went one variable at a time and I just plugged the numbers in, double checking to make sure that I'm looking through what the question's actually asking and I'm plugging in the correct numbers as I go. My little advice for this though, just to make sure you're not making any mistakes, this N times T up here, notice how I wrote it in brackets as 12 times 3. Before you put this in your calculator, you might actually want to calculate that first because it's pretty easy to screw up putting an exponent in a calculator. 12 times 3, that I can do no problem. That's just going to be 36. So maybe instead I'll just write that as 36. That'll make it a little easier for me to throw it in a calculator. So don't mind me, I'm just going to plug this in right now, 5,000, and then close bracket, times by this. All of this needs to be in brackets. That is super important. I'll put like big square brackets around it. That needs to be in brackets with the exponent on the outside of it. So times 1 plus 0.025 over 12. And then close the brackets off and take that to the power of 36. What I got was A equals, and wow, actually I just threw numbers into this. I made this question myself. I just threw things in. This actually works out to a really nice number, pretty much rounds almost exactly to the right dollar of $5,389. So in other words, after the 3 years, even though you only borrowed $5,000, what you actually had to pay back was $5,389. So there was extra $389 on top of that you had to pay, kind of as like the cost of actually borrowing that money in the first place. It is how it is. It's how the world works. It's not ideal, I get it, but like that's just how it works. Now the next question is, what will be your monthly payments? Well, keep in mind, since this is what you're paying in total, and you're paying it for 3 years, that basically means you're going to be making a monthly payment every month for 3 years. And this is what you're paying in total. So here's how this is going to work. Of course, as we know, there's 12 months in a year. So if we go 12 times 3, you're going to see that there's going to be 36 payments in total, right? Now, since you're making 36 payments, and this is how much you're paying back in total, logically speaking, that tells you that your monthly payments are just going to be your total amount you're paying divided by the number of payments you're going to make. So 5,389. Just divide that by the number of payments you're making. So divide that by 36. And that's going to give us, I'll round to the nearest whole cent, it's going to be roughly equal to $149.69. So in other words, your monthly payments, what you're paying every single month for that $5,000 loan, will be $149.69. Okay? All right, moving on here. Starting a small business. Owning a small business is a risk, but it can be incredibly rewarding. Some things you'll need to consider include the following. Is the business right for you? Are you committed to it, and will you stick with it over even rough periods, right? So in other words, owning a small business is not something for the faint of heart. You kind of have to really be dedicated, and you have to really want to do what you want to do. So you got to make sure, all right, if I want to start this business, is it just an idea that I've just had just all of a sudden, or is it something that's like really speaking to me, right? Like if you really wanted to start your own pizza store or something like that, you got to really be dedicated and make sure that you're going to stick through with it. The other questions very important to ask are, is the business feasible? In other words, is it possible to profit from it? So it's all well and good to say, oh, I'm going to have this business. But of course, you know, with how much money goes into making a business, you have to make sure that you're going to make a profit off this. Like you're actually going to be able to live off of having this business, with how much time you're going to have to put in on this, right? And that of course plays a lot of roles. It plays whether or not the thing you're going to provide is needed in your community, whether or not there's going to be a market for it, all that. So the last point there is, who are your potential customers or clients? Are there enough to support your business? So you really have to think about who you want to be targeting your business towards, and whether or not that target audience even exists where you want to set your small business up. So let's do a quick example here. If you were to start a small business offering fitness classes for kids under the age of 15, which city would be a better choice? So we've got Courtenay, BC, and we got Duncan, BC, and some of the demographics, in other words, like the percentage of the population based on age in each of these areas. What you're going to notice by looking at these percentages is that they're pretty close, right? Like really, they're only off by 1% on this age category and on this age category, so they are pretty close. But the number one thing that these two things are off by are population. Courtenay, BC is considerably, well, maybe considerably is a bit of a stretch, but a fair amount larger than Duncan, BC. So here's how I would go about this, right? And there might be more to it than this. There might be like you'd have to look into, are there fitness places in Courtenay, BC already, or if there are fitness places already in Duncan, BC already. We're going to ignore that though. We're just going to look at demographics for now. Notice 16% of Courtenay, BC is between the ages of 0 and 14. So that right there, that's your target. Right? If you're doing fitness classes for kids under the age of 15, that right there is your target audience. And we know it's 16% of the population in Courtenay, BC. So if we go 49,215 people times by 16% as a decimal, that's going to give us, one second here, that's going to give us about, I'll just round it to the nearest whole person, that's going to give us 7,874 kids, right? That right there, that's your target group. You might have a certain percentage of those kids that actually want to join a fitness class, but that's your target group. Now in Duncan, BC, you got 41,385 times that by 17%. Let's see what that gives us. That's going to give us, one second here, that's going to give us 7,035 kids. 7,035 kids. Right? So judging by these demographics, you can conclude that in Courtenay, BC, you actually have a fair number more kids that could be part of your target audience. So if you were starting fitness classes, that implies that you're probably going to be taking like a registration fee from every student that signs up. And therefore, having more possible kids to draw an audience from would probably be better. Now, the reason this question's significant is if you didn't really do any calculations, you might have said, oh, Courtenay, BC, 16% is in the target audience, whereas Duncan, BC is 17%, and 17 is bigger than 16, so it's got to be Duncan, BC. But that doesn't really tell the full story. If you look at the full population, it's clear that there's a lot more kids in that age range in Courtenay, BC. So I would say Courtenay, BC is probably the better choice. But again, there's other decisions to make as well. What if Courtenay, BC already has fitness classes for kids? Well, then you're going to be competing with the other things, so you could pretty much just take this number and cut it in half, right? If not even worse, especially if that place has a good reputation. Anyway, we're rambling. Let's move on. All right, so one of the last things we're going to talk about today are startup costs versus operating costs. So a startup cost are the expenses needed before your business even opens, right? So if you wanted to open a small business, again, I'll come back to that pizza store example. You'd need like ovens. You would need a place that has like a refrigerator to store all of your foods and stuff, right? You'll need a lot of supplies just to even get your business up and running in the first place. Those are startup costs. They generally only happen once, right as you're opening your business. But they're very important to keep in mind as well, because again, if you need to take out a loan to start your business, that's something you have to add all together to even apply for your loan. But on top of startup costs, you also have operating expenses. So operating expenses are the expenses needed to keep your business running. That can include things like rent. Like if you don't own the building, if you didn't actually outright purchase the building that you're going to have your business in, you have to pay rent to be in there. Staffing, of course, you got to pay people to work in your store. You can't just like not pay your employees. It doesn't work that way. Maintenance is a big one, right? So in other words, things break, things fall apart. You have to keep that in mind. That's an operating expense. Even other things I didn't list on here, like you know, if your business, of course, is going to be viable nowadays, you're going to have some sort of internet connection probably, or at very least, you're going to have phone service. So you'll have bills that you'll have to pay. Those, of course, are your operating expenses. Okay, we're going to do a quick example. The following are a list of costs associated with starting a hair salon. Classify each cost as being either a startup cost or an operating expense. Just to save us some time, we'll say, all right, S will be startup cost and O will be operating expenses. I want you to think about these as we go through, okay? I'll list what I think on these ones. Maybe there'll be some argument. I'm not sure. Let's find out. First of all, a venue from which to work. So in other words, a building to actually have your hair salon in. I think most people would probably agree that's going to be a startup cost, right? Now, again, if there's rent involved, that'll become an operating expense. But generally speaking, finding your venue in the first place, that's going to be a startup cost. Professional styling chairs. So in other words, the chairs that you're going to cut people's hair in, right? that should be also a startup cost, right? It's not going to be an operating expense. The operating expense may be maintaining those chairs and replacing them if they start breaking down. But you can't exactly have a hair salon without having these chairs in the first place, so that's a startup cost. Hair washing sink and chair, I think that's pretty clear. That's also a startup cost. Desk, mirrors, and cabinets, also startup cost. Cash register, that's a startup cost. Business license. This is where it gets a little bit interesting. Having a business license in the first place is a startup cost, but you have to renew your business license as time goes on. So that is a startup cost, but I'll also say it's an operating expense, right? Like inarguably, you have to make sure your business license is up to date. At least in most places, that's how it works. But yeah, so in other words, you got to maintain your licensing, right? Telephone and computer. Now, this is also dependent on kind of what they mean on this one. Having a telephone and having a computer in the first place, that right there is a startup cost, but actually paying the bills for these things, so your telephone bill or your internet bill, that would be an operating expense. Laundry facilities. Now, this depends on what you want from your hair salon. You can have a laundry machine and a dryer and stuff like that, like already in your store. And if that's the case, that's a startup cost. But if you are going to be taking it to a laundromat, for instance, then that is going to be an operating expense, okay? Professional hair dryers. So those hair drying machines, of course, that's going to be a startup cost. Notice how many startup costs are on this one? Like, this is kind of interesting. Hair dyes and foils, okay? So in other words, the actual supplies you're using throughout this, that is, I would say, an operating expense. You'll need them at first, but you'll also need them as time goes on. That's not going to be a startup cost. It's going to be an operating expense because you will need to continuously replenish these as time goes on. Towels and capes, that's a little bit of both for sure. So startup and operating costs. Your towels, of course, are going to wear out, and same with the capes that you use, so people don't get their hair on their own clothes when you're cutting them. So yeah, that'll be a little bit of both. And then advertisement. Okay, so advertising your business so people actually know it exists, that is an operating expense without a doubt, right? Yes, you'll probably have an advertisement as soon as your place opens, so you could say, oh, it's a startup cost. But in reality here, you're going to want to continue advertising. You don't just advertise as soon as your business opens, you advertise continually. So that would be an operating expense. So from what we could tell from this is owning a hair salon, there's a lot of startup costs involved, right? More startup costs than there would be for certain other businesses, perhaps, right? So that is important to keep in mind because, again, if you were interested in starting something like that, you'd have to make sure that you had all of your ducks in a row, and you'd have to make sure that you had enough money in the first place to even get your business going right out the gates. And that might come into having a loan, for instance, right? You have to borrow some money to do that, and that is okay. All right, for practice, I want you to do page 294 to 307. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.